Departamento de Ciências da Comunicação, FCSH, UNL.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much to the organisers for their hard work and invitation, and thanks to you, the audience, for staying this late in the afternoon. And you will be pleased to hear that I will keep to time inside the remit I've been given. I've called my talk The Unbearable Lightness of Public Service Broadcasting because the word lightness seems to me to be important, and as I go through my talk I'd like you to think about lightness in three distinct ways in the back of your mind. Firstly, the BBC used to have a head of light entertainment. Now there are cultural assumptions involved in this, but there is no doubt that in the debates around the future of public service broadcasting, there are some people who don't want public broadcasters especially to do entertainment. They would like the serious so-called dull programming to be done by the state or the state broadcaster, but entertainment should only be provided by the market. The second dimension to the word lightness is what I call the Indiana Jones Venice, Italy problem. In the film Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Indy's sent off to find his father, Sean Connery, the world's greatest known Scotsman. And the baddie says to Indiana Jones that his last heard of in Venice, Italy. Now I say to my students, that is insulting. There is only one Venice. You cannot say Venice, Italy, you just need to say Venice. But what the students say to me is there's Venice Beach in the United States, and in any case, I'm being elitist. But I do have a problem, and the problem I have is the way the BBC and other broadcasters constantly, under the guise of being accessible, end up dumbing down. And I'm quite happy to have that debate if you so wish. And then the third dimension to lightness is the neoliberal, and I have to say sadly also New Labour approach to policy, which is that of light touch regulation. Now we know what happened with light touch regulation with the banks. We're still all suffering from that. But there's no doubt in my mind that what New Labour wanted to do, at least up until about 2009, late 2009, when Murdoch turned against Gordon Brown, is that they wanted to soften up the self-regulation of the BBC and put the BBC fully under Ofcom, which is an economic rather than a cultural regulator, more concerned with business and the consumer than the citizen and democratic interest. But again, I'm being polemical, and I'm quite happy to have a debate about these matters if you so wish. So the first thing to remember about the BBC is it was founded in 1926 under a royal charter, and it had governors. So for 80 years, which is a very long time, if you think about the changes in that 80 years from radio to television to colour television to digitalisation and then moving on to the internet, that governance structure worked and worked very well. So the question to ask then is why in the period 2003 with the establishment of Ofcom after the Communications Act, and then in 2006 did New Labour start to change and modernise the governance structure of the BBC and give it, in my view, a paradigm change shift, which was a move from the Holy Trinity of inform, educate and entertain to the new 6 public purposes which are inside the BBC Royal Charter and which are full of the kind of MBA speak that James Murdoch, but not Rupert Murdoch, came up with at Levson Inquiry. I mean, absolutely, not only boring, but they actually conceal more than they actually say. And then, of course, the BBC has always existed in a state of tension with the audience. The government of the day, whether it be Thatcher, whether it be Blair, whether it be Harold Wilson, and that, in my view, has actually been very healthy. But of course, the BBC is also organised under a royal charter, and that is renewed or revised or revisited every 10 years or so, and that again gives a major opportunity to various groups of stakeholders and interest groups to get stuck in and either try to diminish the BBC or change its terms of reference. But again, the BBC Charter remained broadly similar until the early 21st century when these 6 public purposes came in. But there's obviously case study examples as well as, if you like, the law of the Charter. But in the 1960s, Director General Curran said that what BBC should be about is making the popular good and the good popular. And that seemed to me to be a very good definition of what public service broadcasting should be about. In other words, entertainment can inform and educate as well. But of course, there were problems, there remain problems. There's always going to be resistance to a compulsory licence fee, and that's been a problem the BBC has had to face in many years. But as I say, even Morrison and Thatcher could not privatise the BBC, although I think they probably wished to. So New Labour come into power in 1997. From my perspective, good that they can't get round to mucking around with the BBC until the 2006 Charter comes in. But what did the new Charter do? It got rid of the governors. It changed the governance structure of the BBC. Under the argument, which seems to me to be very strange, that somehow the governors could not be self-regulating, that they could not be cheerleaders for the BBC, as well as regulating the BBC. So a substantial amount of the BBC's operations were already by 2006 put under Ofcom. What also happened was that the BBC was put under Ofcom in terms of aspects of the public value test. If the BBC was going to launch a new service, then it had to undergo a public value test which both measured public value, and we can talk about that if you so wish, but also had a market impact assessment which was carried out by Ofcom. Now if you go back to the 1990s when there was a Director General of the BBC called John Burt, one of the things he did was he saw the digital revolution coming, he saw the internet revolution coming, and he should be given credit for that. He should not be given credit for a range of other things, but credit for that. And so the BBC went online very quickly. In my view, and again this is polemical, if the BBC was going into online now with a public value test, including a market impact assessment, then the BBC's competitors would be saying the BBC should not be online because it's crowding up business opportunities for other companies and so on and so forth. However, Ofcom did not have control over the core aspects of the BBC, which obviously are impartiality, accuracy and balance. They stayed under the new BBC Trust. So we've got the 6 public purposes. In the wider ecology, of what was happening around that time, public service broadcasting was starting to disappear from Channel 3, the ITV company. Andrew's quite right, Channel 4 is a public trust, people tend to forget that. It was in some financial difficulty at the time. There were discussions around whether or not some of the BBC licence fees should be used to prop up Channel 4. There was some discussion about whether or not BBC licence fees should be top sliced in order to help pay for what was called non-news regional programming on Channel 3. Because what happened again with the support of New Labour and the New Labour government was that instead of having a federal system for Channel 3, ITV, which ensured that there was broadcasting from different parts of the United Kingdom, those companies were then allowed to consolidate. That had started back in the mid-1990s, and now in effect we've almost got one ITV, and ITV said, it is not in our business interest to produce regional programming with regional production centres. It's in our interest, because we're a business, to actually consolidate and just do the broadcasting in one place and cut costs. And Ofcom accepted the arguments which were being made by ITV at the time, which were largely that the benefits that ITV got from the spectrum, because spectrum scarcity had disappeared, were no longer enough to support them doing programming which was not fully in their commercial interests. So in effect, Channel 3 and Channel 5 and Sky are not they're on a trajectory away from being public service broadcasting, which again is a shame in terms of the history of public service broadcasting in the United Kingdom. So pressure was then put on the BBC to fill this gap, because you had various people, not just members of Parliament and so on, in the border region, for example, Carlisle, saying we're losing our local provision, our local regional news, our 6:30 news programme. maybe the BBC, because you've got all this money for the licence fee and so on and so forth, should go ahead with it. So the BBC came up with a series of proposals which were called local video proposals, whereby what they were going to do was put up on BBC online news, which would then also help to meet this problem. That was killed by the second public value test that took place because of the market impact assessment, because local newspaper owners, because they've got their financial problems as well, said this is subsidised competition, we are not having it, it's going to kill local newspapers. So what New Labour then decided to do was, under Ben Bradshaw, the Secretary of Culture, Media and Sport at the time, was introduce the idea of local news consortia. And those local news consortia it's a fund of money that was going to be taken out of the BBC licence fees. The BBC licence fees top sliced, and then it's going to be awarded to local newspapers or local radio TV consortia that then put a 6:30 news bulletin in the regions onto Channel 3. And that was going to go through before the 2010 general election, but as you know, New Labour lost it and the coalition government came in. But, and this is where I think I really don't trust politicians full stop, no matter which side they come from. The problem with top slicing the BBC licence fee is that once you've set that precedent, then you're moving towards what Melvyn Bragg in the 1990s called the Arts Council of the Year. What you do is, instead of having the BBC providing public service broadcasting and Channel 4, and you try to persuade or regulate the others to do as much of that as they can, not just minimal impartiality and balance, but full public service broadcasting, you take the BBC licence fee and you spread it around a number of providers. And what you then do, of course, is produce a different model of public service broadcasting, which is in the interest of a number of financial companies. So I'm really not all that keen on that idea. But at the same time as this was going on, the BBC was starting to be privatised by the back door, which you may not know about. The BBC introduced something called the WOC, W-O-C-C, which is an operation. The WOC is the window of creative competition. So you may not know this, but only 50% of the BBC's programmes are made by the BBC, 25% by law have to go out to the independent sector, and the 25%, between 25 and 50%, are for competition between in-house and out-house providers. So in my judgment, there is an attempt, certainly was an attempt by New Labour, while they were trying to, they couldn't go all the way in meeting Rupert Murdoch's needs, but went a considerable way to meet Rupert Murdoch's needs in terms of trying to cut the BBC. And then when Cameron came in, of course, the next thing that happened is the BBC started to be treated by the government almost as a government department, and normally the debates about the future of the BBC funding take months and months. Inside 24 hours, the BBC took an 18 to 23% cut, depending upon whose figures you look at. And that cut is now starting to be seen on screen, and also the BBC's inability to compete for some sports rights, which is a long-standing problem. And the BBC took on responsibility for Welsh broadcasting, because that was in financial difficulty. The BBC World Service, well, I think probably that was sensible, instead of a deal done by Mark Thompson and Michael Lyons, instead of being paid for from the Foreign Office budget. And also Spooks. In other words, the BBC monitoring service at Carrington is now paid for out of the BBC licence fee. The BBC, of course, did a number of mistakes under Mark Thompson's Director Generalship. One of the things they did was they bought the Lonely Planet guides. So they were becoming a global media player, and they became too commercial. And what they've got to try to do is make sure that, as a public service broadcaster, yes, they maximise their assets internationally, so that helps to make it a more financially viable and vibrant organisation, but they shouldn't really go. That was a step too far in terms of becoming commercial. So where are we going from now? Well, the BBC is now facing a perfect storm, I should say, not a public storm, and I'll talk about this only for 3 or 4 minutes very quickly. The BBC's next charter renewal is due on review in 2016. That is just after the scheduled UK general election in 2015. which means that there's a danger that the future of the BBC will become a political football in the general election campaign of 2015. And I think, the best thing for the BBC is always to stay away from that. But more than that, and this is where I have a personal interest, my country in October 2014 will have a referendum on whether or not we break up Britain, which also could mean breaking up the BBC or turning it into a federal BBC, and my nation becomes an independent nation with a seat at the United Nations, presumably a place in the European Union, and so on and so forth. So the BBC is the British Broadcasting Corporation, and it faces particular challenges in replacing that. Let me give you some very quick background. In 2007, the Scottish National Party became a minority government in the Scottish Parliament, and the first thing Alex Salmond did, near after our First Minister, was to set up a Scottish Broadcasting Commission. And we discovered that the BBC raised 9% of the licence fee in Scotland, but only spent 3% of the licence fee in Scotland. And the Scottish Broadcasting Commission, first one we'd had, and I would recommend that to all of you, to have a broadcasting commission to look at the strengths and weaknesses of your media ecology, certainly put pressure on the BBC. So a month after it had been set up, Sir Michael Lyons, the chairman of the BBC and a trust, and also Mark Thompson came to Scotland and said, we will raise the amount we spend in Scotland from 3% to 9%, and we will do that over the next 3 or 4 years. And to be fair to them, they've done that. So there's a political pressure on them to go down that road. But the other nice thing about the BBC public purposes is that the research done by the BBC in Scotland has clearly identified a gigantic purpose gap. Most people in Scotland, and they don't have to be SNP, identify themselves culturally as Scottish, even if they want to stay part of the United Kingdom, but nearly all see the BBC as the London Broadcasting Corporation. And so what the BBC has to do, and the research, the King reports there and so on and so forth, is actually stop referring to England as though the term England meant the same as the United Kingdom or Britain, and start to be more sensitive to pluralism and diversity across the UK. So what will happen to the BBC in 2015, 2016? I think it will continue, but watch this space. Thank you.
Thank you.